El día de hoy tendremos a Erin Baker. Ella es profesora asistente en la Universidad de Albany, del estado de Nueva York. Ella es de la Escuela de Educación y del Departamento de Psicología Educacional y de Medición. Y nos va a hablar de temas de razonamiento moral entre niños. Okay? So, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thank you for inviting me. I also have no idea what Ed just said, so I'm going to explain a little bit of my background. Also, I speak very quickly. Sorry. If you need me to slow down, please just let me know, or if you want me to explain anything in more detail. I will try to slow down automatically, but that does not tend to work, so please let me know. As I think Ed said, I'm in the Educational and Counseling Psychology Department, which is in the School of Education at SUNY Albany. If you are in the School of Education and you think that you found a peer who really understands education and pedagogy and all of that stuff, I was not trained in education. I've never taken an education class, so I'm sorry to disappoint you. I am a developmental psychologist, and I just happened to land in a School of Education. So if there's grad students in here, that is a good lesson on how these things tend to work. You may get training in one field and find a job in another one. But anyway, so my research that I'm going to be presenting on is how young children, so preschool age, 4 or 5 year olds, how they understand aggressive behaviors and how they really think about aggressive behaviors, and how their thinking about it informs those behaviors that they then display. So this title came about as this was kind of put together recently. We were on a flight back from a conference in Paris less than 2 weeks ago, and in the row behind us there was a mom sitting with her 2 young children, and the older child was 3 years old and the younger child was just a couple months, and the older child kept hitting his head against the forehead of his brother, and he was doing it very forcefully, and the younger brother started crying, and the mom just says, "Why would you do that? I don't understand." I'm like, oh man, that's my entire research program right there. We as adults or as parents, as teachers, we really don't understand a lot of how children think about things, and so we're constantly asking, why would you do that? Specifically about aggressive things, because we really don't understand. We don't think that they're bad kids. We don't think that they're little jerks or anything like that, so why would they do these bad behaviors? And so that's really just what has informed my research. So a little overview of what we're doing today is just really unpacking what my research program actually looks like. I come from a couple different domains of developmental psychology, and so trying to knit them all together has been kind of interesting. So I'm going to introduce that first and then tell you why you should care, although the fact that you're here means that you do, so maybe I should skip that part. And then I'm going to be covering what will look like 4 different studies. So the first was part of my dissertation, and then I did 2 small follow-up studies after that to kind of inform what the results were for my dissertation. And then the last thing is a very recent study, kind of an ongoing project that was also informed by my dissertation. So you're basically going to be seeing 4 different sets of results, all around the idea of how children learn to think about beneficence and harm, basically. And then I'm going to finish up with what I'm doing now and things that I hope to get started relatively soon. Also, I practiced this with seeing my notes. You can make notes, and I obviously can't see them now, so this is going to be a bit of a rough ride, so we'll see what happens. So my research overall, as I said, is focused on understanding children's behavior. There's a number of different theories, for instance, Bandura's social cognitive theory, Turiel's social cognitive domain theory, or maybe it's just cognitive domain theory. More recently, Judy Smetana's updated iteration of social cognitive domain theory. But then from judgment decision making, there's also the dual process model, and Kenneth Dodge's work on social information processing. There's a lot of different theories that inform how we all think about aggression, how we might arrive at aggressive behavior. They all tend to kind of agree with one another if you look at them more broadly. So for instance, Bandura's theory suggests that we take this environmental information, these environmental cues about what is valued in our particular environment, and we try to align our own beliefs, or we tend to align our own beliefs to be more consistent with what the environment is, and that leads to different types of aggressive behavior, for instance. But they all kind of, in different ways, understand that there's this cognitive side of behavior, of aggressive behavior. And we are looking at aggressive and prosocial behavior in my lab, not just aggressive behavior, but you're just saying the aggressive side of things. So we do tend to recognize that there is this cognitive force, this cognitive agency that should, in theory, at least drive the aggressive behaviors that we see. But also, because we're talking about aggressive behavior, there's definitely this emotional component. So for instance, if you see riots on the streets or someone being violently attacked, you have a very emotional response. There's this affective side of behavioral understanding. So to try to disengage the behavior from the cognition or from the environment doesn't make sense. We also have to have the cognition, the emotion, and where I come into all of this is recognizing that some of our cognitions are inherently tied to our emotions. And we do that by looking at moral judgment and moral reasoning. So moral judgment and moral reasoning is our cognitive process for how we think about issues of harm and beneficence. So how we think about issues that contain this emotional component. So it's kind of this, again, knitting together the more rational side of things, if you want to follow the judgment decision-making literature, with the much more impulsive and emotional side of things. So the dual process model, for instance, in the JDM literature suggests that we tend to, if we're allowed by environmental cues, we tend to rely on a much more rational and kind of mature way of thinking and making decisions about things. So we weigh the benefits and the consequences, and then we arrive at our outcome. But if we're threatened or if we're under strain or anything like that, then we tend to rely on a much simpler process, the first process, which just is impulsive and emotional, it's automatic. So all of these different theories kind of suggest that if we're talking about aggressive behavior, which should be this more emotional side of things, particularly for young children whose brain maturation kind of limits their reasoning, then we cannot just focus on the cognition, which is what many theorists were thinking for a while. We have to also look at the emotion, and the best way to possibly do this, let me back up. The way I want to do this is by looking at how children are reasoning about issues of beneficence and harm, because that should at least inform how they value different types of aggressive and prosocial behavior. Am I speaking too quickly? Okay, excellent. So the first jumping off point is, why do we care about this? And this will really take us into the first study quite easily. So if we look at aggressive and non-aggressive adults, for instance, we can really see that aggressive adults really tend to have a different understanding of morality than non-aggressive adults. So research shows that aggressive adults and adolescents, not just adults, older individuals who are aggressive, really, it's not that they are amoral, they don't understand moral issues or that they think everything is okay, it's that they really struggle cognitively to process moral issues. And so if you give a vignette of harm to someone who has been leading a more aggressive lifestyle, they don't really respond to it the way that a non-aggressive individual would. They tend to not necessarily see that it's an issue of harm, but maybe an issue of convention. And by that I mean issues of harm issues of morality deal with harm and beneficence. Conventions deal with things like social order, so like waiting your turn and things like that. So individuals who are older, adults, that are aggressive, tend to rely more on social conventions and like, well, they didn't really follow the rules, and so that's what's wrong. But there hasn't been a whole lot of research with children looking at whether we can see these same distinctions. And this is an important question because we shouldn't necessarily assume that young children also struggle with that moral cognition the way that older adults do. And the reason for that is, one, these are really young children. As I said, they're 4 and 5 years old. Their brain is still very much developing. So their cognitive ability to process that type of information isn't fully developed yet, so we cannot make the same assumptions. But secondly, aggressive behavior is really common in young children. If you have a child who's not at all aggressive, that's really exceptional, honestly. And so we don't necessarily want to make the same assumptions about aggressive children that we would aggressive adults, because it's also much more impactful, right? If you label a 3-year-old as being an aggressive child, that implies that they are aggressive compared to the norm, which wouldn't necessarily be true, because again, most kids are aggressive, but also you're labeling that child, and so that would necessarily inform the education that they get, how their peers interact with them, how their parents are going to respond to that type of behavior. So we want to be very sensitive to the possible developmental issues behind aggressive behavior. see what's going on this slide. Okay, so the first question that we wanted to ask was how young children come to think about aggressive issues. And if they are children who identify as being aggressive, which again is not a bad thing at this age, it's very, very common, are they thinking differently about social and moral issues? So first of all, are there even differences at this age? We have to first address that assumption. Secondly, are they thinking differently from their non-aggressive peers? And again, to say that a child is non-aggressive is also quite exceptional. That's rare, honestly, that they're displaying no issues of aggression. So we thought to kind of dissect aggressive behavior into 4 different clusters, which I'll get to in a second. But basically the question is, are there cognitive processing differences that we can see among these different behavioral clusters? And what does that really look like? Can we answer the questions about the assumptions that we're making? So in this first study, we had 176 preschool age kids, so they're about 4 and 5 years old. This is from the Midwest, Bowling Green State University area, which is in Ohio in the United States. Generally a pretty affluent sample, which brings in a whole host of possible compounds and issues that I'm not going to get into today, but I'm aware of it. But we can discuss that later. The interviews were conducted over 3 sessions, and this is because we did a lot of qualitative and quantitative stuff with them, and you really can't ask a 3-year-old to sit down for 45 minutes and do anything, really. So we broke it up into 3 sessions. It was not an experimental design or a longitudinal design, we just did it in 3 different sessions that were completely randomized per child. We had measures of theory of mind. Raise of hand, who knows what theory of mind is? Who doesn't know what theory of mind is? Okay, so theory of mind is the general understanding that we as adults have very easily that another person has different beliefs, desires, expectations than you do. And the follow-up, the more important part of that is that creates an agency, right? So that we arrive at behavior that is goal-directed, that is consistent with our own beliefs, right? So we measured theory of mind. We also measured morally relevant theory of mind. So it's theory of mind within this moral context that I'll explain in a second. And then we also had the children indicate their own preference for moral behavior, harm and beneficence. I'll explain these all somewhat. So to measure theory of mind, Willman and Liu in 2004 kind of took all the different measures of theory of mind because there's so many different angles of theory of mind. There's so many different ways to measure theory of mind. So they put a whole bunch together and basically graded them based on the expectation of what the typical child should have at a certain age. And that is to say that theory of mind develops very, very slowly. Adults still demonstrate that they don't have theory of mind really regularly. And so theory of mind tasks are not a simple one and done kind of thing. You really have to give various measures in order to tap into that construct effectively. So for instance, the diverse desires task, this is based on the passage rates and based on previous literature, the easiest task that we gave them. This basically is asking them, do you recognize that this person wants a snack that you don't want? So it's just recognizing that a person can have a different desire. That's it. The second one is recognizing that someone can not know something that you know, that this person doesn't have access to knowledge that you have. The third one is kind of expanding upon the knowledge access task, and that is looking at how an individual understands that one person's understanding of reality is not necessarily accurate of reality. Extending from that a person can hold a belief about reality that is actually false. So it's not just that it doesn't represent reality, but that it is, you as the agent, you know that that belief is wrong, in fact. And extending from that a person can simultaneously demonstrate 2 different realities, particularly with regard to emotion. And so by that I mean, you can display one emotion on your face and actually feel another emotion on the inside. They're organized in order of difficulty. So as I said, diverse desires is the easiest test for children. In this sample, 80% of children passed it. That means that I believe the youngest child in this sample was actually 2.5. She did not pass it, and some of the younger 3-year-olds didn't, but by about 3 years, 2 months, most children were passing this task. And then they're sequential. And then the real apparent emotion test was much more difficult, I believe. There were many 5-year-olds that didn't pass this test. And so what Willman and Liu in 2004 demonstrated is that this is a very slow process, but it's also very predictable. That we know what to expect of children at different ages. And because of that, we can actually test this, and we give them a score that is consistent with the number of tasks that they pass, basically. If you have more questions about this, ask me, or look up the article. It's an interesting article on it. To measure morally relevant theory of mind, so now that I've told you what theory of mind is, well, I've told you what theory of mind is, told everybody else how I measured it, we wanted to see how that theory of mind, how that cognitive capacity was impacted by also having to process moral issues. And so we're kind of testing them on whether or not they can maintain their theory of mind strength in a unique, multifaceted situation. So we did this with Melanie Killen's measure that she and some colleagues developed in 2011, or published in 2011, called the Accidental Transgressor Task. It's a qualitative interview. If you do qualitative data, I feel like you're just like, yes, somebody understands the issues of doing a semi-structured interview and having to code all of that stuff. And it's like, yes, I do. Welcome. So basically, you give them a vignette, which I'll show you in a second, and then you ask them about 30 follow-up open-ended questions. And then you have to code their open-ended questions. And coding the open-ended questions of a 3-year-old, or the open-ended responses of a 3-year-old is just the most fun that I've ever had in my life. It's hysterical. Anyway, so this particular task has the following vignette. This is Tommy, this is Josh. Tommy has brought in a cupcake from home, and he's keeping it in this paper bag. Tommy puts the paper bag on the table, and then Tommy goes outside to play. Josh decides to clean up the classroom, and he sees the paper bag. Josh throws the paper bag into the trash. So at this point, whenever you're actually interviewing a child and you tell them that Josh threw the paper bag into the trash, the child usually will say something like, oh no, that's so bad, he's not gonna have a lunch, he's not gonna have a cupcake, he's gonna be so upset. And I say that because if you don't do work with children, you usually don't know how to assess different psychological constructs with children. And this is how we do it. So they always say, like, well, how do you know it works? I'm like, well, listen to them. They're telling you that, like, this is an upsetting situation. Anyway, so as I said, we have about 30 follow-up questions to this. I'm not going to talk about all 30 of them. I'm going to focus on the 3 that I am bringing up right now. First, victim responsibility. Should the victim have done anything different before going outside to play, and what should he have done? So for this one, we're talking about how much they agree that he should have done something differently, he or she. They were gender balanced. We're also looking at their emotion recognition because we want to see if there is that emotional side of their cognition of beneficence and harm. What features seem to be more salient for different types of children? So we did this by asking them, how will the transgressor, not the victim, how will the transgressor feel about throwing the bag away? Should he have this emotional response, and what should that emotional response be? And then lastly, looking at their endorsement of punishment. And this one I think is particularly interesting because punishment is inherently a moral issue. We are usually taking away something positive or giving something negative. And so by punishing someone, you are causing harm, but it's usually, if we're doing this correctly, it's a justified harm. We as society, or as civilians or whatever, tend to think that the punishment fits the crime, as they say. And so punishment is a really interesting form of harm in that they can absolutely say, like, yes, he should get in trouble, and it's okay. It's not necessarily indicating harm, but it indicates a certain degree of agreement with the harm itself. So here we're asking, do you think the transgressor should get in trouble for putting the bag away? And then we focused on a little trouble or a lot of trouble. So to what extent should this person be punished for what they did? And then we also had them indicate how much they agree with different aggression profiles. So this was a forced choice puppet interview of prosocial and aggressive behaviors. Anybody ever done? Yes, Ed.
So why do you have, because in the story you had 2 people, right? Or 2 children. One was the transgressor and the other was the good guy.
Mm-hmm.
But the questions were only about the transgressor. So why would you have a second child?
Why? What do you mean? So why in that story
because
are
there was the bad guy who ate the bad boy, let's say, the transgressor, who ate whatever he ate,
mm-hmm.
and then left the bag there, and then the other boy took the bag and put it in the
No.
trash. No, I didn't get the
Okay.
oh my god. I didn't pass. I don't pass the test then.
Okay, Tommy,
Okay.
Josh,
Okay.
Tommy, the blonde one, brought in the cupcake from home and he's keeping it in the paper bag.
Uh-huh.
He goes outside to play. Or
Okay.
he leaves it on the table and then he goes outside to play. So no one's eating anything.
Yeah.
He basically brought his lunch, put it on the table, it's in a paper bag, doesn't have his name on it or anything, and then he walks away.
Okay.
The other boy
Uh-huh.
comes in, sees the paper bag, and throws it in the trash.
Okay, but all the questions were still my question hold.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. So still the questions are about the transgressor, not about this, the second board.
Well, this is the transgressor, but your point still stands, right? Like, it does. So some of the questions that we followed up with, first instance victim responsibility, did focus on the victim.
Okay.
But these are also only
I
3
was
questions
looking-
out of like 30, right? So we want to see, you don't want to just focus on the transgressor because that's not, well, that does necessarily inform their understanding of a transgressor's cognitions or their reasoning about it. It doesn't necessarily inform how they perceive victimhood, which is just as related to aggression as being the transgressor is, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Excellent question.
No.
And thank you for
That
making
was
me
not,
repeat
but
that, because
still.
I'm sure if you were confused, other people were as well.
Okay.
Okay, where was I? Forced choice puppet interview. Has anyone ever done one of these before? Okay, how do you ask a child if they're aggressive? Yeah, you can't really do that. They're just like, no, I never hit my friends. I would never do that. That's bad. The way that developmental psychologists get around this is with puppets. So I don't know if this has sound or will play, but let's find out. Okay, you can't hear that. I can't hear that. Oops, let me just tell you what the puppets were saying. So, in this task, there's 15 different scenarios just like this. We present 2 different puppets, and we basically say, hey, Iggy and Ziggy, the puppets, are going to tell you about things that they like to do and things that they don't do. And we want you to tell us who you're more like. Are you more like Iggy or are you more like Ziggy, and how much you're like that? And then each of the different items is asking them about a specific type of aggressive behavior or prosocial behavior, which I'm not presenting today. But the aggressive behavior, I think for this particular vignette is, when I get mad at someone, I pull their hair. And then the other puppet would say, when I get mad at somebody, I don't pull their hair. And then we simply ask the child, who are you more like? People who do, or researchers who do research with adults really tend to question whether or not this is valid, and I really invite you to look at the research on this because it's surprising. Children will not tell you, yeah, I hit my kids, but if a puppet asks them if they hit their friends, they're gonna be like, yeah, sometimes I do that. And I do it a lot. So anyway, so that is how we arrive at measuring their different aggressive and prosocial tendencies. Okay, so based on that last measure, the Iggy and Ziggy measure, children were identified as belonging to one of 4 different behavioral clusters. Aggressive, prosocial, non-social, which I think I also refer to as asocial in a few of the slides, and then balanced. Aggressive children, as the name suggests, tended to give really highly aggressive responses and tended to give very few prosocial responses. And these children were significantly younger than all of the other groups, which is to be expected based on what we know about how aggression changes as we get older, and therefore we controlled for aggression and everything. Prosocial children gave highly prosocial responses and very few aggressive responses. Non-social children, or asocial children, gave low indicators for both aggressive and prosocial responses. So these are the children who were kind of just like, I don't like talking to people anyway. I don't like doing nice things or bad things. I want to go read by myself. And then we have the balanced children, which gave high indicators of both prosocial and aggressive responses. Yeah?
How did you classify those groups? How did you decide which one was high, prosocial, or?
I believe it was a median split, which I agree is not the most elegant way to do that, but we didn't have the number of children needed to do the better options, basically. But yes, we have the aggressive items, the prosocial items, and the no, I'm not like that response for every single item would have been in line with the non-social response, right? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So once we identified these clusters, then we went and looked back at their theory of mind is where we started. So we wanted to see, just first of all, do children with different social patterns, basically, differ in how they understand other people based on theory of mind? And the biggest difference we found here was that non-social children significantly outperformed aggressive children. And this was, again, controlling for age. So we would expect that, yes, younger children would be worse on theory of mind. Obviously, that's just what theory of mind is. And so we controlled for it. But yet, non-social children were still significantly better at theory of mind tasks than the aggressive children. And they were better than everyone, but they weren't significantly better than the balanced children or the pro-social children. And so the understanding that we get from this is that perhaps non-social children, it's not that they don't understand social behaviors or that they are being non-social because they're confused by these social behaviors. Maybe they're actually taking a step back from these social behaviors or these social interactions. Maybe they are being more reflective. Maybe they're watching their peers a lot more instead of interacting with them, and they're actually learning just from observing them. It's also possible, if we're considering the aggressive children, that maybe there's this other cognitive issue, like maybe they're dealing with inhibitory control issues, and so that's really what's pushing this theory of mind performance more than anything else. Next, we wanted to look at how children think about victims, how they understand victimhood. Specifically, should the victim have done anything different? And so to understand this, we coded their responses to fall along a continuum from the victim should not have done something to prevent the harm to the victim should have done something to prevent the harm. So it's really looking at this sense of agency within the victim to prevent the harm that was done to the victim. So how much responsibility do you have to prevent harm that befalls you? And again, there were group differences, but with other groups this time. The balanced children were much more likely than the prosocial children, but really the difference here is the prosocial children, so let's go that way. The prosocial children, compared to all other groups, were much more likely to say that the victim should have done something different on his own behavior to prevent the harm, which is weird. That's a wonky finding. You would not expect a child who's saying like, yes, I like to share and I like to help other people, to then say, well, that person kind of had it coming because he did this thing. Yeah.
Isn't that consistent like with a belief in a fair world?
Right, and so that's whenever we looked into their reasons behind that. So we didn't just ask them, could they have done something different? We asked them, what could they have done differently? Excellent question. And the responses they gave tended to focus more on issues of a fair world, right? So issues of societal balance and civil responsibility. So saying like, and you also have to think about like the interactions that preschoolers tend to engage in at this age. So they're constantly being told by their teachers, you have to clean up the mess that you made. If you want something to be there later, you have to put it back in your own cubby. So there's kind of, not that these are bad lessons, obviously, but they're constantly being reminded that you have your own responsibility in the world to take care of your things. The message that seemed to come out here was that, well, the victim did kind of have it coming because of this thing that I've been told is justifiable, right? So, for instance, if a child brings a special toy to school and they don't put their name on the toy or they don't put the toy back in their backpack at the end of the day or at break time or something, and then at the end of the day, if the toy can't be found, the teacher's gonna be like, well, did you take care of it? The parents are gonna ask, well, did you make sure you knew where it was? Did you share it with your friends and then ask them to give it back to you? So we're constantly engaging children in this process of what was your own sense of responsibility to prevent the harm that came. But yeah, so their responses weren't aggressive. It's not like, yeah, he was a bad kid who had it coming, which would be a moral issue. They're much more focused on, well, he could have put the bag away. He could have told the teacher that that was his bag. He could have put his name on it. So they're not necessarily giving aggressive responses, but they are saying that there's this sense of order that we all are responsible for. And lastly, we wanted to see how children thought of, or not lastly, I'm sorry. We wanted to see how children thought about motives of the transgressor with this accidental harm. So we're looking at the proportion of children attributing positive emotions, which is tapping into their motives in a really, really simple way. We did have questions pertaining to intention and motivation that were a bit more complex, and children sometimes didn't understand that. So this was a simpler way to get at that. So here, we found that prosocial children were also much less likely to attribute positive emotions to the accidental transgressor. So they're more likely to say that the guy that did bad stuff is going to feel bad. And again, the interesting thing here is, in their responses of the intention and motives that I alluded to a second ago, they're indicating that, no, he didn't have bad intentions. I know he didn't have bad intentions. He was trying to help clean up the classroom. I know he had good intentions, in fact, and yet they're still saying he's going to feel bad about this. The other groups are still not saying that he's going to feel good about the harm. They're more likely to say, well, he may not feel anything, because again, it was an accident. He probably doesn't know that he did anything wrong. So that he shouldn't necessarily have an emotional response. But the prosocial children are saying, yeah, he didn't do that on purpose, but he should still feel bad. So the prosocial children are kind of tying together the harmful outcome with this harmful intention while still not recognizing that that's what they're doing, which I think is fascinating. And then lastly, looking at their punishment endorsement. And this is for intentional harm, so I didn't actually present this measure, but it's very similar to the accidental transgression task. It's basically saying one child pushed another child off the swings and then all the same follow-up questions. So we're looking at punishment endorsement. And the reason that we wanted to look at this for intentional harm is because the intentional harm task is easier. It's simpler. It doesn't involve this weighing this possible moral confound that you have to consider as intention. It's a very clearly overtly harmful outcome. And so it's easier for children to cognitively process. So here, we found that the non-social children, which again I refer to as asocial children, were significantly less likely than all other groups to suggest that this person should not get in any trouble at all, even though it is an overtly harmful act. So a child walks up to another child pushing on the swing, pushes them off the swing, and then gets on the swing. There's not really a question about why they did that there. It's really just like, this kid did something bad and they know it. They see the other child with a scraped knee. They should understand this. The non-social children are still saying, yeah, maybe he shouldn't get in trouble. Which again goes back to not that they don't understand social interactions, but they are perhaps less likely to intervene. So when they're watching, when they're observing, when they're not being social, are they less likely to go up to a child who did something bad and say, hey, that wasn't nice, you shouldn't have done that? Based on this, we would say that, yeah, that non-social children may not be aggressive, may not be nice, but they're also likely to not intervene in these harmful outcomes, or in these harmful situations that they're saying, which is important, I think. So basically what we get from this was that aggressive children possibly struggle with social interactions either as a function of theory of mind, which may lead them to aggressive behaviors by way of frustration, or that's much more causal than I am allowed to be. Maybe they don't understand the impact of their aggression. Maybe they're aggressive anyway, and their limited theory of mind kind of keeps them from understanding the outcomes of harmful behavior. Maybe they don't understand what it means to be a victim, or how that harm actually impacts another person. So there's 3 possible issues, which led us to 2 of the follow-up studies that I'm about to present. First, theory of mind may not actually translate to moral contexts. And by that I mean we measured pure theory of mind. We didn't actually look at whether or not their moral theory of mind, so did the transgressor know what was in the bag? We didn't look at how well that corresponded to theory of mind. So we want to first examine whether or not children are able to transfer that capacity as easily as we would expect them to. Again, as adults, we make a lot of assumptions about what children can and cannot do, and why would you do that kind of thing? It seems so obvious to us. Children don't have that luxury, so children struggle with things a lot more than we do. Secondly, aggression is a really broad behavior, so as I've conceptualized it so far, aggression is one main thing. In reality, it's made up of many specific types of behavior, and so it's possible that we wouldn't necessarily see these connections if we're looking at specific different subtypes of aggression. And then lastly, aggression is usually an emotional response. So in measures here, we're not specifically tied to emotional capacities. And so that's one thing that we kind of want to address as well. The first follow-up to that is looking at that theory of mind and morality component. So according to the empirical research done by Melanie Kilden and some of her colleagues at the University of Maryland, some of her students, we know that children can display very elegant theory of mind. They can pass all of these tasks, but whenever you look at their scores in the embedded task, the morally relevant theory of mind task that I showed you, they're not failing that key component. So what is that capacity that they're not really having? A lot of research in this area suggests that executive function should inform this, which is something that I very briefly alluded to earlier. Executive function is a lot of different things altogether. It's inhibitory control, it's working memory, it's attention, it's this really kind of foundation of cognitive capacities that we kind of take for granted as adults. But there's been a lot of research that shows that executive function kind of allows for theory of mind development. So executive function, if you want to put it very, very simply, pushes theory of mind development and not the other way around. So our thinking here was that perhaps executive function is actually what's allowing them to produce a well theory of mind, and perhaps with the embedded task, their cognitive resources are being strained, and so that's why they're not performing as we would expect. So we went back to the same participants, and we gave them a Stroop task. This is the day-night Stroop task. It measures inhibitory control and cognitive interference. It's appropriate for 3-year-olds. If you have more questions about it, ask me there. So we wanted specifically to look at how passing the Sally Ann task corresponds with the same question in the moral theory of mind task. So the Sally Ann task, if you're not familiar, it's this cute little vignette where this is Sally, and Sally has a basket. And I apologize that you can't read this, by the way. This is Anne. Anne has a box. Sally has a marble, and she puts the marble into the basket, and then Sally goes out for a walk. Anne takes the marble out of the basket and puts it into the box, and then Sally comes back, and she wants to play with her marble. Where will Sally look for her marble? This is a hallmark theory of mind task by Simon Baron-Cohen, I want to say, is the first person that developed it. And it's basically just recognizing that a person can have an expectation that is inconsistent with reality. They hold a false belief, is to use the proper term. The corresponding item in this task, sorry about that, is what did Josh, the boy that threw out the cupcake, think was in the bag? The boy that threw out the bag, what did he think was in it? So the item here is, what does this person think is in these two containers, and similar corresponding item here. So these two should, theoretically, be passed at the same rate because they're very, very similar questions. Of course, that's not what we found, because why would I be presenting it otherwise? So what we found was that if we looked at how executive function, the speed of their response for only the correct responses on the executive function task, we assumed that would moderate that, and it did. So the blue line is the children who failed the Sally Ann task. We're not necessarily interested in those kids because they failed the original task, so let's focus on the other kids. These are the children who were correct on their Sally Ann task. And what we're looking at is the probability of their success in passing the embedded task. And we're looking at it again as how quickly they responded accurately in an executive function task. So the children who responded more quickly on an executive function task, again, while being accurate, we didn't even look at inaccurate responses for this. So if they respond more quickly to the executive function task, they had a higher probability of successfully passing the moral theory of mind task, which is a bit counterintuitive, right? You would think that if they slow down their processing, they will be more likely to arrive at that correct answer, at least according to dual process model, right? Interestingly, that's not what we found. So the children who took longer to respond were much less likely to pass the task. So what we are considering here is that theory of mind is perhaps an easier construct to tap into than what the moral theory of mind assumption is. So yes, it's embedded, but perhaps it's actually simpler than what we're expecting. If children are taking longer to really process this, maybe they're actually spending more time on that emotional response that they're having to it, that, oh no, what happened? What's he gonna have for lunch kind of thing. Whereas if they answer more quickly, perhaps they're actually less likely to get confused by all of the corresponding information. The second follow-up that I'm gonna touch on is unpacking aggression. So again, the first time I was conceptualizing aggression as a singular behavior, which is misleading, and research shows that it can really lead to overgeneralizations. And I presented it first because I think it's interesting, but also then it lets me present this stuff and show you how wrong I was before. So the way that aggression, there are several ways that aggression can be conceptualized. The way that I think makes the most sense according to my own reading, my own studying in the area, is consistent with a lot of Jamie Ostrov's work, and he's at the University of Buffalo. It basically considers aggressive form and aggressive function at the same time. So aggressive form is relational versus physical aggression. Aggressive function is reactive versus proactive aggression. You may not know what I'm talking about. So physical aggression is punching. Relational aggression is rejecting behaviors, name calling, things that would affect a social relationship or relationship dynamics more broadly. Reactive aggression is in response to provocation. Proactive aggression is just doing a mean thing because you either want power or you just want to be mean, basically. So if you consider both of these simultaneously, you arrive at 4 different types of aggression. Physical proactive aggression, so doing a physically mean thing like pulling someone's hair simply because you want to. A better example of that would actually be taking someone's toy simply because you want the toy. Physical reactive aggression would be someone calls you a name and so you shove them in response. Relational proactive aggression would be calling someone a name or not including someone in your peer group simply because you know that it hurts their feelings. Relational reactive aggression is being the person who doesn't get invited to join a group and then spreading rumors, which is not typical for children this young, so I guess a better example would be not getting invited to a peer group and then calling that person a name, or saying they can't be your friend anymore, for instance. So basically the research on this shows that there's different social outcomes related to this. So for instance, children who are more proactively aggressive tend to have less reciprocal friendships, they tend to be excluded by their peers. Children who demonstrate relational aggression, oddly enough, tend to be more popular and they have more friends. I still don't understand that one, but whatever. So basically, the research kind of shows that there's enough evidence to suggest that these really are 4 distinct patterns, and we should probably consider them as such, particularly if we want to know anything about treating that type of aggression. So, same participants, we went back and we gave their teachers the preschool proactive and reactive aggression scale made by Jamie Ostrov and Nikki Crick. And it measures the 4 different types of aggressive behavior plus prosocial aggression. For this particular sample, all of our alphas were good, so we moved forward and didn't really worry about it, basically. That's not necessarily always the case, and we didn't consider it nested just as a limitation, but that's something that I plan to address moving forward. I'm moving through this rather quickly again, so let me know if I need to slow down. So we looked at how motive understanding and theory of mind and how this possible interaction relates to each type of aggression. So for physical proactive aggression, this is, I believe, red. Yeah, so theory of mind, main effect. So children who had low theory of mind tended to be more aggressive. This is not surprising. If you know any of the research on aggression, physical proactive aggression is kind of immature. Physical aggression is generally considered less mature than relational aggression. Parents and teachers agree that it's less mature. They're actually less likely to punish relational aggression simply because they see it as being a more elegant form of aggression. So this one is not that exciting. We didn't see a moderation or anything like that, but generally better theory of mind, less physically proactive aggressive behaviors. For physical reactive aggression, we saw 2 main effects and the interaction. So generally we saw that better theory of mind, less aggressive behavior, better moral understanding, more aggressive behavior, but the big difference here was for the children who did have better moral understanding. So if they had better moral understanding, better motive understanding, I apologize, then they were going to have higher aggression. If they also had a higher theory of mind, then that's when we started to see lower levels of aggression. So children who understood the motive that this was an unintentional task generally tended to be more aggressive. Physically aggressive, which is fascinating because that's kind of inconsistent with what we would expect from the developmental side of things, but it's also odd that we would expect a child to display motive understanding while not necessarily performing well on theory of mind tasks. So it's possible that morally relevant theory of mind tests are actually an important marker or an important measure for for children, specifically who tend to be more aggressive. Maybe theory of mind tests are not their strength. Maybe they struggle with social cognition and yet really understand how to be impactful when it comes to harming beneficence. So maybe they're actually stronger in their moral understanding than they are in their social cognition. One possible conclusion from that. And then again, for relational proactive aggression, we also saw that there was this effect of mode of understanding. So children who tended to demonstrate low mode of understanding tended to have lower theory of mind. This looks like a significant interaction. It's not, unfortunately. Okay. So the more recent study that I was just analyzing like 2 weeks ago, I was just presenting at the International Society for Research on Aggression, looks at all of these same constructs and all of our same understanding of executive function, theory of mind, morally relevant theory of mind, all of that good stuff, but does it under the effects of ostracism. So ostracism is social exclusion, simply. And the research on social exclusion suggests that children who are being rejected by their peers should want to re-engage those relationships as quickly as possible. So if a child is being excluded, they're more likely to, or they should be, more likely to engage in behaviors that will help them build those bonds that have kind of been severed. So they should engage in greater mentalizing, that is trying to engage in greater theory of mind, for instance, but they should also demonstrate behaviors, display behaviors that suggest that they're interested in regaining their social status. The dual process model suggests that yes, we should see greater mentalizing, we should see them being much more elegant in these social situations, but because they're stressed, they were just excluded, they're going to have a hard time doing that. So we should see greater mentalizing, but not necessarily as sophisticated mentalizing as we would typically expect. For this study, again, we had a lot of the same measures, so I'm not going to go into depth with all of that, but basically this was a randomized control trial. So at time 1, we got demographics, we did the accidental transgressor test, that was the Josh, Tommy, and the cupcake thing, and the self-behavior report with the puppets. And then about 2 weeks later, we randomly assigned them to one of 2 conditions in cyberball. Who knows what cyberball is? Okay, excellent. When I presented this 2 weeks ago, everybody knew what cyberball was, so I didn't even have to explain it. Cyberball is a computer game that's basically a digital version of catch. So we would sit the child down at the computer to start the second session, and we would say, I have some paperwork I need to do, but because you're such a good helper, I'm going to let you play a game on my computer, and you get to play with other kids in other classrooms, and you're all playing together. And we would teach them how to play the game, and then say, okay, so you're basically playing catch with your friends. So I want you to imagine that you're playing catch with your friends, and you're having a great time, and that's the game you're going to play while I do some paperwork here. For the children that were randomly assigned to the inclusion condition, they started playing the game, and they kept playing the game. Nothing big happened. They were playing with 2 other partners, and the game just continued playing. They were included the whole time. For children randomly assigned to the exclusion condition, they were included in the first 5 tosses of the game. So within the first 5 tosses, the other players were still playing with them and would still throw them the ball. But after that, they started to be excluded. They did not receive the ball, I believe, after the 10th throw at all, and then the game continues for about a minute and a half.
So what's the catch name? Sorry.
What's the catch game?
Yeah.
Cyberball.
Well, okay. What is it? Is it like you throw a ball and then you need to?
You throw a ball to. So basically, you get to play. You're playing catch with 2 other people. So if you and Dave and I, you don't know what catch is?
Yeah.
I throw you a ball, you catch it, you throw it to Dave, Dave catches it, Dave throws to me or to you, and you just throw a ball around. Sorry. Okay, I thought you had never played catch before.
No, maybe with a different name.
No, right, sorry. When I prepared this for Paris, I didn't think about how that would be interpreted. Yeah, so you're throwing a ball with other people. So in the exclusion condition, the children were included in the game for the first 5 to 10 throws, and then after that, the children were no longer being included. So they were still playing the game, but the Confederates were not throwing the ball to them anymore. And when I was presenting this a few weeks ago, someone asked, how do you know that they're still paying attention? Because I have a 3-year-old, and I would never let my child, the child would not sit there for a minute and a half if no one's playing with them. And it's an excellent question. So we also we did audio recording for all of these, and we measured the number of utterances the child gave indicating that they were curious about what the game was doing or the other people or anything indicating that they were still paying attention. Most of the time it was, first of all, they definitely were. There's a very strong, none of the children in the inclusion condition did anything. They just kept playing the game. They didn't say anything. They didn't interrupt the research assistant. In the exclusion condition, the children regularly reached out to the researcher to say, they're not playing with me anymore, why aren't they playing with me, they're being mean, things like that. They did not give any indication that the game was broken, which would have been an issue, for instance. So they didn't say, the game's not working, the button's not working, why can't I play, the game isn't working, or the computer's not working. They were always saying, this relationship is being flawed, basically. And then the research on cyberball shows that for children this age, the effects should wear off in about 15 minutes. So we only gave them 2 tasks to follow up because we only had 15 minutes. So we gave them the accidental transgressor task again, and then the behavioral report again. So at time 1, there were no differences in different types of aggressive behavior, which is kind of what we would expect. There's no reason to have them be different. In time 2, the children in the exclusion group indicated that they would be much more proactive and relational in their aggression. So they're much more likely to say, at time 2, after being excluded, I would name call somebody just because. Or I would not let somebody play in my peer group just because. Which sounds pretty awful and pretty negative, if we're being honest. But again, the research on different types of aggression shows that proactive relational aggression is actually significantly related to being popular and having more mutual friends. It's actually a weird pro-social tool. It's actually a strategy for developing better friendships. I don't understand that, again, but it works. That's what the research shows. We also wanted to know, within the accidental transgressor task, when the transgressor did that, did he think he was doing something all right or not all right? And then looking at the why. So here we're really focused on what is the moral justification that this person might have. Why do you think he did something? So they didn't differ, for instance, in whether or not they thought the harmful action was bad. They were just as likely at time 1 and time 2 across groups to say, like, yes, this is a bad thing, not super bad, but it's a bad thing. But they did change in the types of responses. So at time 1, there were no significant differences in types of responses that they would give. At time 2, the control group, so the children that were included, tended to answer more along the lines of psychological harm, which is what we saw at time 1 across both groups. So psychological harm would be saying something like, well, that's bad because that would hurt his feelings, or she'd be mad if someone did that to her. So they're engaging in this perspective taking, but it's a kind of limited perspective taking. It's focusing more on the emotional outcome of that. The children in the exclusion condition tended to focus more on property damage and pro-social reasons. So they would say, because he threw the bag away. So they're not actually engaging in mentalizing about the victim. They're simply saying, like, well, it's bad to throw things away that don't belong to you. So it's it's a simpler explanation. Or, when they were mentalizing, they were trying to justify that it was okay. They're saying, he's trying to be a good boy. He's trying to be helpful. So when they were mentalizing, they're doing so in a way that is more likely to lead to possible social growth, basically. And then again, we wanted to look at punishment endorsement. So what we're saying here is, at baseline, the groups did not significantly differ from one another, and at time 2, they didn't significantly differ from one another either, but these colors are terrible, so I apologize for that. The exclusion group, the group on the left, significantly decreased in the amount of punishment that they endorsed for the transgressor. So, same situation, and again, they did not judge the action to be less wrong. You would think that less punishment should correspond with them judging that the action is not as bad. We didn't see that. They're still saying, yeah, it's a bad thing, it's just as bad as the first time I saw it, but he shouldn't get in trouble. So the way that we're understanding this is by thinking that perhaps by indicating less punishment, they're trying to re-engage that social connection again, because they're not, if you go up and tell your friend that they did something wrong, they should get in trouble, that friend's probably going to be mad at you. So maybe they're saying, like, no, he shouldn't get in trouble because that wasn't That's just not something you need to get in trouble for instance. Again, they're still saying it's just as bad, but you shouldn't necessarily follow up with high levels of punishment. So to sum up, theory of mind may relate to specific types of aggression more than other types, which may help to explain some of our previous null findings of why theory of mind doesn't necessarily relate to aggression. There should, and based on the evidence here, there should be an interplay between theory of mind and morally relevant theory of mind as they relate to specific types of aggressive behaviors, but also how they relate to executive function. So we really probably should spend more time looking at the cognitive foundation of things if we really want to understand how children are understanding and explaining harm and beneficence. Children's perceptions of others' knowledge and intention, so again, focusing on that social cognition piece, may help to explain the changes that we actually see in aggression from early childhood or within early childhood. And again, theory of mind and moral theory of mind may actually facilitate certain types of aggression rather than decrease certain types of aggression, as we expected. So some things that we're doing right now is continuing the exclusion and rejection on moral reasoning. We're manipulating that a bit more to see how children are understanding victimhood, so focusing more on when you're not the victim, when you're the transgressor, even if you're not intentionally excluding someone, what does that actually do in terms of your moral reasoning? We're also looking at authorities' tacit consent to abusive out-group members, so we're doing this specifically looking at how children understand when it's okay for an adult to say that that kid is bad, specifically for immigrant peers. And then more of the basic stuff, less experimental, which I think experimental is more fun, but you need the basic stuff too. So looking at how hot versus cold theory of mind today, I only presented cold theory of mind, but if we want to look into that more emotional side of things, we have to look at the hot theory of mind and how that relates to social and relational aggression. And also, this other thing that we're doing right now is looking at how parents and teachers perceive their role in moral education across the day. So for instance, if they're saying, well, you're supposed to get in trouble because you hit your friend, that's a moral message. And many teachers and parents actually aren't aware that that is a moral message or that they're saying anything about how children should understand how to inflict harm. And so we're looking at how perceptions of that actually inform their own parenting and teaching behaviors. And then we're also doing a longitudinal replication starting in a few weeks of all the studies I've been presenting today because they were cross-sectional, not longitudinal. And if you have any questions, I think we have time. But this is also my email in case you don't want to talk right now. And thank you again. Great, thanks. If there's no questions, then let's go.
1 second, we're still elaborating.
Yeah, I talked fast and it was a lot to process.
Question, where would you put the bulliers boys?
The what?
The
Bullies.
those that
Bullies.
make bullying.
What do you mean, where would I put them? You're saying where would I put them?
See, which of the 4 groups?
So bullying differs, as I'm sure you know, from typical aggressive behavior. So bullying is much more about a consistent pattern of behavior. So not just like, oh, sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't, but it's very, very consistent. There tend to be consistent victims, and it tends to be about control and power. So it's not just victimizing someone, it's victimizing someone who is weaker than you or smaller than you or something like that. So we actually didn't look at this here because I'm not actually in that research area. That's definitely, a lot of the bullying research is similar to this. But I think, so Jamie Ostrov, who I mentioned several times in here, does do some of the stuff on bullying. And I was speaking with him about it a few weeks ago, and he's trying to fit the study that I just presented on ostracism into the bullying paradigm, because there were a lot of the research on bullying and different types of bullying, so the 4 different types of aggressive behavior. If you tend to be bullied in one of those areas, you're not necessarily a bully in all of those areas, which makes sense, again, just based on what we know. But it would depend on the type of bullying that they're engaging in. So again, looking at the different types of aggressive behavior, if you are more relationally aggressive, and if you're a relational aggression bully, then you should be much higher in theory of mind. You should, that's kind of what relational aggression is, right? Like, you have to understand what another person is thinking and feeling if you're going to be a good aggressor if you're actually going to hurt somebody's feelings. So I would expect that it would depend on the different type of aggression, but it should still correspond with what the aggression literature is showing. So we would see, more rejection for this type of bully, but less rejection for that type of bully, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
One question about that. So what you're showing is that aggression changes in terms of the context. So after this experimental design, you see changes in aggression. But many studies are showing that aggression is quite stable over time.
Right.
So how can you explain these changes? It's like aggression is not part of the person; it's more contextually based. Or?
I'm kind of saying both. So it definitely is stable, but I think what a lot of the research doesn't demonstrate, so for instance with the longitudinal study, we are building in an experimental component in the later waves. It's a 5-year study, but you're right, it's definitely a stable thing. But if we're only considering that aggression should be stable, if we're only getting this snapshot of aggression and we're not being sensitive to what's going on in the environment, we may not actually be tapping into aggression effectively, basically. So if we're looking at a child who is consistently rejected all the time, then yes, that whatever aggression score that they get should probably correspond with accurate, typical aggressive tendencies. But if a child who goes to school one day and just got excluded from a group, or they were picking sides for a game or something like that, and he was the last person to get picked, and then we go try to measure that a person's aggression, or then we try to observe that child's aggression,
Right.
we may not be getting an accurate representation.
And the other question I had was, I'm sure you're familiar with Patricia Hawley's theory about the strategic controllers, right?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Do you know the theory by Patricia Hawley about the strategic controllers? So supposedly people who can use either prosocial or aggressive resource control strategies to gain power or popularity or yeah. So, that applies to like older kids, right, and teenagers and stuff. Do you have any ideas on that? Any thoughts on that theory? Do you think it's accurate, or how can your research inform that?
I do think it's accurate, and that, right, so what you said is that it's definitely been shown in older children and adolescents, and that's kind of where the field of aggression is somewhat split, because we know a lot about adolescent aggression and how that relates to delinquency and adulthood behaviors. Childhood aggression is kind of distinct from that, right, because aggression is much more common, so we shouldn't necessarily, again, what I started with in the whole thing was, we shouldn't necessarily see the same corresponding relationships that we would expect with older children. So at this point, it's really just kind of unpacking to get to your point of how do children actually use aggression? Is it actually a strategic tool, or is it just kind of a response?
Emotional.
Right. And so at this point, we're still trying to kind of knit together the more salient features of the moral harm and really the context that the moral harm occurs within in order to understand how they're actually reasoning about it. So we're still trying to make that connection between like the moral reasoning side of things and the actual moral action, I guess. Yeah.
I was thinking on the same thing just as
We work together, so yes. Yeah.
In this model of Patricia Hawley, she says that the strategic controllers, those who use aggression and social behavior, should be the ones that have a higher moral reasoning, a higher capacity over understanding relationships. That's why they use the relational aggression and all this part. But when what you were just saying in this moment, I was thinking on the perspective on how to analyze this data, because if we think that all the kids are going to respond to the same way, I think we're making a mistake. Because while some kids may use aggression in order to obtain resources or popularity, there are other kids that are responding into the environment as a reactive form, or I don't know, in different ways. So I think the data that you have shown is pretty interesting into that line, and that maybe the shift onto that way of thinking would be really useful for understanding more over these data.
Yeah, I think you're right. There really are, I think the focus on individual differences is kind of the happens that all children who even respond that, yeah, that was a bad thing to do, are thinking about it the same way. So as a follow-up to this, we're currently looking at how children morally disengage, so how they tend to justify, basically, and the types of justifications that they're going to give, and trying to see if we can see different clusters of responses. So if a child does tend to focus more on issues of fairness and harm and like social responsibility or something like that, that means a very different type of moral understanding than a child who is using it as a strategic social tool, right? But yeah, that's a good point. Yes?
So I was thinking about the finding on the reaction times.
Mm-hmm.
So if I understood correctly, so the more time, the less, can you repeat?
Yeah, so for the children who passed the task, we were interested in how well they would pass the other task and what explained that difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the children who, on the executive function task, they're responding correctly, but if they take longer to respond correctly in the executive function task, we're seeing that they're failing the morally embedded theory of mind task. So basically, they're right, but they're questioning whether or not they're right before they arrived at that response in the executive function task.
Okay.
And so the thinking there is maybe they are arriving at a similar answer in the moral theory of mind task, but they're maybe questioning it, or they're trying to like think about it longer than they are, and maybe that's leading to some confusion.
So there's some research on behavioral game theory,
Mm-hmm.
which like the prisoner dilemma and stuff, and they have looked at reaction times and whether people who take longer in answering, if they cooperate or they make selfish decisions. And they find that the more time they think about it, the more selfish their decision. And the reason, and also when they manipulate perspective taking, that leads to less cooperative behaviors.
How are they manipulating the perspective taking?
Like think about the other guy.
Oh, okay.
What the other guy
So
would
just
do.
prompts that they, okay.
Right. So the basic finding is that in these games, they're all cooperation is important and trust is very important. And there are two ways of thinking about trust. One is very rational, and other is more emotional. And that the initial reaction is to trust other people, and that explains that they don't take much time. They tend to cooperate, and then they become more rational and more selfish. So maybe I was thinking that maybe you can, because it's in the last issue of current research on cognitive theory or something.
Okay.
So it's something that maybe it might be connected with this.
Yeah, that would make sense. That was actually one of the findings that like I don't even know how to think about, because it's so inconsistent with what so many different theories were suggesting that that finding, we're actually still working on that paper now, and we're going to be presenting it at SRCD, Society for Research on Child Development. But yeah, the thinking there is that perhaps they are being not selfish, because the alternative responses aren't necessarily selfish, but they are they're cognitively weaker, if that makes sense. They're cognitively less sophisticated. So I'm saying that the children are like maybe getting confused, but it's not necessarily that they're being confused versus they're not trusting their own judgment on it. So like they want to say like, well, he thought it was a cupcake, or they're wanting to say no, it wasn't a cupcake, or thought it was trash. But the slower they are to respond, maybe they're also identifying with the victim more. Maybe that is coming from, they're relying on that more emotional place. And so maybe they don't actually believe that it is a cupcake. Maybe their response actually isn't valid at that point. But yeah, I don't know. I need to follow up with that. I don't know how. Yeah.
Have you thought about including rejection sensitivity, for example?
No, that's a great idea.
I think it would be very interesting.
That is a great idea. I'm actually not a ostracism researcher. The last study I presented, the one with ostracism, came about because I was at a conference a few years ago, and I was hanging out with one of my friends who does ostracism research, and we were just like having a great time, and we're like, we should do research together. What can we do that puts all this together? So we just kind of like put this together. So I'm not familiar with ostracism research, and she and I are also in the process of writing that up, the first wave of results, and developing the second study, basically to answer all these questions. But yeah, including rejection sensitivity is a great idea. Thank you. Do you have a measure of that you can send me?
I was looking for it, and there's a measure.
For young kids?
Yes, it's CRSQ, Children's Rejection Sensitivity Questionnaire.
Excellent. Yeah, send me that. That's my email.
Yes.